Let's talk about building materials for a second and walk me through, just on a simple level, the kind of construction materials, assuming a long-term hold, that you would use for single family, multifamily, and mixed-use mid-rise. How would you build those kinds of buildings if money was no object and you were tasked with choosing the
I mean,
materials?
the future of materials, I think, is a question mark because it's all tied up with the environment and how much emphasis we put on building green and the long-term future of buildings, the life of buildings, and use of energy, and so on. Uh, Up to now, modern building tended to be layers and layers of very thin buildings. Each layer does something else. So you have an insulation layer,
Mm-hmm.
a membrane layer, and an exterior layer. Those walls are very efficient, very cheap, but will they last a very long time? This building I'm sitting in is made out of stone this thick.
I read,
Nothing
yeah.
can happen to it.
18 inches, yeah.
You point the outside, you paint, you repair the plaster on the inside, but nothing terribly horrible will happen inside that wall because it's just a stone wall. It gets wet, then it dries out. It gets wet, then it dries out. When you get walls with these layers and layers of different materials, most of them synthetic, all sorts of horrible things can happen. Foam insulation in 100 years can disappear. Plastics can crystallize, all sorts of things. You have inert gases inside 2 layers of glass. What happens to that inert gas in 100 years? We don't really know, but we're pretty sure that, gaskets will dry up and fail. And unlike this 100-year-old stone wall that's this thick, they may have very short lives. Now, the greenest building is the one that lasts the longest and fulfills a function the longest. So having buildings that you rip down and you have to replace the wall after 20 years and the windows only last 20 years because the gaskets fail, none of that is very green. So depending on how we approach green building in the future, the way we use materials, we know that these old buildings from hundreds of years ago have lasted because they're around us. We use them. So this is not necessarily obsolete technology because we're using it. It exists today. And so the future of building materials could be more and more obscure, more and more sort of technical materials, or it could be going back to saying, wait a minute, if we want a building to last 100 years, maybe, we know what works and what lasts 100 years. It's not these layers and layers of thin materials. It's maybe very thick materials. So it's hard to know what the future holds because a lot depends on how we really deal with the environmental and the energy aspects of a building. Tearing down a building is enormously wasteful. And so a building that lasts 100 years is a very green building because you've invested something and then you amortize it over 100 years. I remember the city of New York about a decade ago started monitoring energy consumption by building. And they started with commercial buildings because those were the biggest buildings and it was sort of more doable. So it's not house by house, but it's office building by office building, say in Manhattan. And they now have records of exactly how much energy does the Chrysler building use, or the Empire State Building, or the Goldman Sachs building. They know exactly. And the idea was to get sort of a database so that you could deal with the issue of energy conservation in a rational way. What they discovered was very interesting, that some of these old buildings, like the Empire State Buildings, are extremely efficient when it comes to using energy because, they have a lot of solid walls. The window space is limited, maybe 50%, maybe less than 50% of the wall. And some of these modern buildings, I mean, the worst buildings were those buildings from the 50s where they used single glazing. The Seagram building, for instance, is a disaster in terms of energy use. It's a huge amount of energy. The Chrysler building is very good. What was really shocking was that some of the so-called green buildings from the 2000s were terrible. They didn't actually use less. They used a lot more energy than the Chrysler building. So it really calls into question, if you make an all-glass building, you can make it very fancy, but it's never going to use as little energy as a building that's 30% glass, like the Empire State Building that has a lot of solid walls. So this question of materials really depends on what is going to be the future of our attitude towards green building and saving energy, and how are we going to calculate those things.
When your own house was built, do you think, how extreme was the price premium they paid for that, or was that just simply the way we build things in that era?
It was actually, it was built by developers, many of the buildings. The stone was local, so it was actually cheap because they quarried locally. It was a relatively soft stone, so it wasn't expensive. You could just build rubble walls. It wasn't like dressing it and making fancy stone construction. You had to repoint periodically the exterior.
Are the interior walls stone
but
as well?
But it was cheaper than brick, for instance. Brick would have cost more in those days. And the big difference with today was the labor cost was lower. So the fact that a mason had to spend a lot of time putting up these rubble walls wasn't a big issue because labor costs were low compared to today. And of course, there's no insulation in the wall. So in terms of insulation standards, they were quite different.
Are the interior walls?
These are original windows. I mean, these are 100-year-old windows, and they have a second layer of glass on the outside. So they do have storm windows, which cut down on the heat loss. But there are very few windows made today that are going to last 100 years. Yeah, so they may be more efficient in energy conservation, but then if you have to throw them away after 30 years, that's not very efficient.